All across the globe, cemeteries and historic buildings are disappearing. The histories and names of those buried there and who lived there are in threat of being lost forever. I am on a mission to tell their stories. This is Grave Hunter.
So I just got myself in a potential situation. I'm fine. It's all fine. But I came out here to Gower. But as soon as I got off the interstate highway, whatever it was, I started feeling weird. Like the vibe of the area was already not sitting well. And I was coming out here in search of the Gower Cemetery, which was originally the private cemetery, then town cemetery of the Gower Plantation, centered around the Methodist Church, who William Gower, who founded the cemetery in 1816, was the minister of said Methodist Church. A couple of years ago, I think descendants found that there was a bunch of slaves buried there because, of course, William Gower was a slave owner. I wanted to come see it because it was in the middle of kind of nowhere. It looked creepy. Of course, there was actual apparently markers of some of the enslaved people there, so I wanted to go there, pay my respects. I get out here, I find the church and the plaque, and the vibe is weird, and all I see is all of these private roads to houses and no sign for the cemetery. And then people start coming outside of their houses, one by one. It was feeling very predatory, very creepy. I knew I was being watched. Finally, I spot some headstones through the thicket. So I park at the church and I start walking, trying to find how to get in there. Realize I'm on probably private property, but then I see a sign for the cemetery and I'm like, this isn't private property. This is towards the cemetery. It's all fine. Then there's like a private gate that I cannot open and I see the cemetery through the woods, like right there. I got a video of it from a distance because eventually I realized I shouldn't be here, and this graveyard is just maybe not worth my life. So I'm about to get the hell out of Gower, and I suggest maybe don't try to look for the Gower Cemetery. Not worth it. So I am here at the Bellmead Plantation, which was owned by members of the Bellmead family for almost 100 years.
Welcome to Bellmead Plantation. In 1807, 250 acres of land were purchased by John Harding, who built a humble cottage on the site and brought with him 3 enslaved people. In 1816, he bred his stallion, Boaster, thus beginning to make Bellmead the premier thoroughbred stud farm in the country. Almost a decade later, the Bellmead racing silks were registered and in use until the 1980s. By 1819, the construction of the main house began, and over the next 30 years, Bellmead would expand, helped in large part due to John's son, William Giles Harding, marrying Elizabeth McGavick of the McGavick family we talked about in our last episode. He expanded the home, the horse breeding, and Bellmead quickly became one of the most profitable plantations in Tennessee. By 1860, the Harding family had one of the largest slaveholdings in the country, with 136 individuals, 63 of whom were children. When the Civil War broke out, the men of the family donated heavily to the Confederate cause. Once the war was over, 72 of the former enslaved individuals stayed on to work for pay at the plantation. 2 of the most famous freed African Americans associated with Bellmead are Robert Greene and Susanna Carter. Robert stayed on after emancipation and became the holster for the plantation and would eventually become known as one of the most knowledgeable men in horse breeding in the country. Susanna Carter was born free, but illegally purchased by Randall McGavick when her parents died. When Elizabeth McGavick married William, she was brought to Bellmead, and long after emancipation, stayed on making her famous blackberry wine that you can actually still taste and buy at the winery. Until her death, she spoke fondly of the Hardings and her time on the plantation, and that's a strange pill to swallow. Through the years, the plantation would be continuously expanded on. A carriage house for all of the cars would be built, a smokehouse, an ice house, vineyards, and more. Bellmead was the Disneyland of Nashville.
It's kind of a complicated story. It's an interesting story. The tour is amazing. The mansion is gorgeous. You can't film or take pictures inside, but the grounds are awesome, so I'm going to show you guys as much of that as I can.
Just outside the carriage house is a grave for one of the horses, Inquirer, who ended up fathering many of Bellmead's most successful horses. His grave was not originally here, but the headstone later moved. Still, it's a fitting tribute to an animal that the Hardings were clearly obsessed. Naturally, Belle Meade has stories of hauntings. It doesn't take long once you've stepped inside the home to feel something off. The opulence feels like a cover for something more sinister in the shadows, which isn't surprising considering for a century, this home housed a family devout in their Confederate beliefs and profiting off the backs of the very people who toiled the land. I may not have a specific story or ghost in particular to share, but I promise the energy of Belle Meade would make a skeptic a little curious.
So this is kind of a sobering plaque they have here. So it's all about slave burials. And as you can see, it's right next to where they would have lived. And basically what it says is, like many plantations and slave owners, they did not keep records on when their people died or where they buried them. And if they had records of it, they no longer exist, such as the case with Belle Meade. Now, what they do know is because embalming was not widespread, the enslaved people that died absolutely would not have gotten embalmed and probably would have been buried very shortly after death. Now, something that I did not know that this board talks about is that usually slave funerals were held at night because that is least likely when they would need to work, which also meant that other slaves from neighboring plantations could come and pay their respects, although a lot of people didn't because either they were forbidden or they were worried that a group of enslaved people might be seen as rebellion and they were worried. Apparently also, which is interesting, most of the times, obviously, they were in unmarked graves, and if they were marked, it was with seashells or pebbles, because apparently in some African cultures, white is synonymous with death instead of black. So they have no idea where the enslaved people of Belle Meade were buried. They think it might be on the outskirts. Again, there are no records. They haven't done any kind of deep research as far as using LiDAR to try to, find the grave. So another stark reality of what life was here, even though it may not have been one of the worst plantations from what I'm hearing. Still a plantation, still not right, still segregated, still very depressing. One of the things that I really appreciate about this site and why I chose to come here is because they really aren't glorifying what happened here. They really are making a conscious effort to educate people about the enslaved people that worked here and bring the humanity back to a really awful time. So right here, we are standing in front of what I believe is a reproduction of what the slave homes would have looked like. As you can tell, we are literally just down the path from the main house, but they wouldn't have lived in the home. They would have been on the outskirts because that just was not socially acceptable. Now, this goes into more detail, this plaque right here, about what happened in 1865. So it said 136 enslaved men, women, and children at Belle Meade Farm gained their freedom in 1865. With this freedom, they gained the right to choose where they would live and work. 72 farm workers continued under the employ of General William Giles Harding, with 4 families continuing to live on the grounds and many others commuting to work each day from various neighborhoods around Nashville. So down here, there is an actual picture of what the living quarters would have looked like, as along with a mission statement from the museum. It says, "Our mission is to preserve and interpret the historical value of Belle Meade Plantation and to educate the public about its significance in American history. Through generous donations, Belle Meade Plantation acquired this half acre of land in October 2001, thus preserving part of our history nearly lost to development. Continuing efforts in archaeology will tell us more about the material culture and lives of the families who lived here in the 19th and 20th centuries." I just think it's really important, especially in this day and age, to tell both sides of the story. Too long we have glorified the white telling of the South, and it's time for all stories to be told.
Inside the cabins are endless displays and exhibits about the lives of the slaves and later freed African Americans who worked the plantation. One of the most poignant lessons I learned while exploring was that although many of the slaves converted to Christianity, none of their music or hymns were ever recorded because the white population didn't deem it worthy. It is through that music we had the beginnings of the first banjo and the origin of country music.
And in case you thought the family had a soft spot and, was all for equality and friendly with everybody, here are some shackles, and here are some logs of purchase records, as well as a will dictating how she wanted her slaves passed down. So, just when you're feeling like things might not be so awful, history comes and slaps you in the face. So I am right here behind the slave homes, and there is a stone here with a plaque, and I want to read it to you guys. So it says, dedicated to those who came to this farm as slaves and freed men, names known and others lost to history, whose toil and sweat turned a wilderness into Belle Meade. Their efforts remain today as a testament to the artistry, craftsmanship, and skill that created this nation's premier thoroughbred nursery. At this point, we can only do so much to right the wrongs of the past, but I think the most important thing is to continue talking about it, to continue educating people about it. And if you are interested in visiting Belle Meade, they have 2 different tours. They have the Mansion Tour and the Jubilee Tour. The Jubilee Tour welcomes people to have conversation about what slavery was like here on the plantation, makes us confront these very uncomfortable social unknowns to us, but very social norms back in the day. So highly recommend that tour. Recommend both, truthfully. They've done a brilliant job of, you know, putting plaques up around and really doing a self-guided educational tour if you don't want to do the Jubilee Tour, but highly recommend. Like, this is a winery, by the way. This is actually Nashville's first winery, and your tour comes with a complimentary tasting, so highly recommend. The wines are very different. They are known for their Tennessee sweet wines. Their #1 bestseller is a blackberry wine that literally tastes like blackberry juice with that punch in the face. Very interesting, but this place was like the place to come, be entertained, be seen, until horse racing became a thing that the temperance women targeted because people gambled and spent too much money and drank and blah, 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 blah. So that was the partial downfall of the family. And then, of course, the Depression. Before Belle Meade was Belle Meade, John Harding purchased 250 acres of basically pasture, woods, ranch, whatever you call it out here, and built this cabin. It is still here. We can check it out. Kind of spicy. Oh, how quaint, how cozy. Oh, we have a mixed use space. It appears we are in both the bedroom and the kitchen. I mean, it's like, oh, but also look at the walls. Very cute. Feels almost Nordic. Getting a little midsummer vibes happening here. Midsummer, I don't know how you pronounce it. There is clearly a ladder, or that's not a ladder, folks. That's a staircase. Oh, and we have another bedroom and kitchen / dining room. So maybe this is the dining room and bedroom, and the other one was a bedroom and kitchen. You know, you gotta make the most of your stay. I don't know if I'm allowed up there. The chain's down. No.
Welp, after fleeing the plantation upon trespassing it into an area, I headed to my favorite small city, Franklin.
So I am outside the Carter House. This is where the Lotz family came to seek shelter during the Battle of Franklin. The battle damage here is unbelievable. And the really important thing to know about the Battle of Franklin, it only lasted 5 hours. 10,000 people died, and the most Confederate majors of any battle in the war happened here.
The Carter House is definitely one of the most incredible historical home tours I've ever taken. This house has the great honor, if you want to call it that, for being one of the most Civil War battered, still standing structures in the country, and it's obvious why. While the Lotz house did have remaining damage, the bloodstains are everywhere at the Carter House, including the back porch. Bullet holes still litter the sides of the house, and the cellar, where over 20 people, including the Carter family, their servants and slaves, and the Lotz family, hid for hours behind barricaded door while thousands of people perished in their very backyard. One of those people would be one of the Carter's sons, Todd, who had left the law and joined the Confederate cause. Like most of these homes, I couldn't take any documentation inside, but the stately home with some of the tallest ceilings I've ever seen still bears the marks of the war, and the damage from inside the house, where some of the first shots were fired in the battle, still visible to this day.
So we are at the city cemetery here in Franklin. This was the first burial ground and churchyard of the First Presbyterian Church here. The graves are in dire condition, but it's unbelievably beautiful. Look at this one, just absolutely collapsed and really in bad condition, a lot of this. It's sad to see. I don't know if some of this might have been damage from the battles that came through here. My guess is probably not. I don't think the fighting actually ever got this far. I don't know what direction we are. They came from that side. I'm thinking the south, whatever. I'm not good with directions, folks. I'm not a human compass, okay? Relax. So here's some crazy numbers for you guys. So in 1864, the city town of Franklin only had 750 residents. When the Battle of Franklin took place November 30th, 1864, 50,000 Federal and Confederate troops fought here. That is a lot of people, and then 10,000 people died. It's numbers in horrors that you really cannot even imagine. And everybody talks about Shiloh, everybody talks about Gettysburg, but very few people actually talk about Franklin. And it's shocking to me because it was horrible. And I know we keep talking about the Civil War, but this little plaque talks about the soldiers of the Revolutionary War that are buried here. That is old. Directly across the street from the city cemetery, we have the Rest Haven Cemetery. In 1855, a lawyer donated some acreage for a new cemetery for the city of Franklin. It is at this cemetery that Todd Carter, one of the sons of Fountain Carter of the Carter House where he just came from, is buried. Now, he fought for the Confederate Army. He suffered 9 bullet wounds from the Battle of Franklin that tore apart his own family home, and he eventually succumbed to his wounds and died 2 days later or 3 days later. The battle's on November 30th. He died December 2nd. Really tragic event. There's some prominent people buried here, a lot of Confederate soldiers buried here. So gonna try to find Todd's grave. I think it should be fairly easy. It's a sizable plot of land, but it's not the largest. Oh, what is this? Unknown Civil War soldier. Found a plaque. October 10th, 2009, the community of Franklin honored this unknown Civil War soldier with a period military funeral at St. Paul's Episcopal Church. This is really emotional. This right here, this really cool monument, this broken column, is a monument for the unknown soldiers that died in the Battle of Franklin. So you have to imagine there's thousands of young men that fought that battle on both sides. And if you died on the battlefield, unless you had identification later when trying to identify your body, so maybe later you might actually get a marker on the cemetery, they didn't know who half these people were. And further than that, so many of their family members never got closure because they just never came home. So they were left wondering, where did they end up? What cemetery was their body put in? So this monument right here is a monument for all of the unknown soldiers that died, all 10,000 of them that died here. Found Todd Carter. His grave is definitely sinking. It is not in the greatest condition, but thankfully they have a marker here. I mean, this guy suffered 9 wounds and he was a prisoner of war at one point, and then he went back. He's either 19 or 20 years old, was a lawyer, left the law to go fight in the army. It was a tragic event. Sadly, he was fighting for the wrong side, but ultimately justice prevailed. Unfortunately, things weren't as good or kind for Todd. Thing that I'm starting to realize, and I'm really grateful for being here and touring all these sites, is, it's so easy to think about the Civil War, especially when we're on the West Coast. To think about the Civil War is just this thing that happened in history, and there was a very clear, good guy and bad guy situation. And then you come here and then you learn the personal stories of some of the people that fought on the Confederate side, or just the bystanding people who lived here and just happened to live in what was a Confederate state and just tried to survive. And you start to really realize that, yes, there were good guys, there were bad guys. It was a horrible war, but ultimately they were all human, they were all American, and every single life that was lost during the course of the Civil War is tragic. And I'm just really grateful for the personal connection and the tangibility that this trip has brought me, because until now it was this foreign thing, and now I feel like there's a connection. It's real. The people were real. The tragedy was real. And yeah, I'm just really grateful. So right behind me is Toussaint Cemetery. This is named after a slave leader that led to the independence of Haiti. There are a ton of freed slaves here, as well as a lot of African Americans from this county. So I'm happy to see a place that actually is dedicated to these people and is named after somebody that did something very important. So I'm going to check it out. Okay, so here's an insane coincidence. I literally just parked my Jeep, just started walking down this way, and what do I find? I find a headstone over here. This is crazy. On here is listed Sam Williams, Judia Williams, California Carter. California Carter, folks, is one of the slaves of the Carter family who was in the cellar with the Carters and the Lutz trying to escape the fire that was happening outside their place. They escaped the battle. They were sheltering in place in the cellar. I just can't, you know how hard it is for me to find graves? I'm looking for graves. Like, grave hunting is not always easy. I literally just got on my Jeep and I found one of the people that was there. This is a grave hunting miracle, everybody. Please pay attention. Somebody, please. I'm excited. I'm so excited. Fair warning, if you come to Toussaint Cemetery, especially in the older section, there is a newer section. You can see it behind me. In this older section, there is a lot, and I mean a lot, of sinkage. So be very careful when you walk, because I about just broke my ankle in a grave. So, proceed with caution.
Pro tip for Toussaint Cemetery. That road I was driving on? Yeah, not a real road. Got stuck and had to Austin Powers out of the cemetery without hitting 200-year-old headstones. Just PG. Later on, the man and I returned to Franklin to check out the McGavock Confederate Cemetery, which just happens to be on an old battlefield. The feeling of being there at dusk is hard to describe, but eerie is probably the closest I can get. 1,500 Confederate soldiers lay below identical markers crowned by the McGavock family cemetery. An incredible thing to see. Tune in next week when I explore the home of one of my least favorite presidents, Andrew Jackson. Spoiler alert, it's an emotional roller coaster. Until then, chin chin, creeps.